Bryony had been rejected exactly once, publicly, in front of the entire pack, and once, it turned out, was more than sufficient to teach a person precisely how quickly kindness could disappear when it stopped being convenient. She'd built her small cottage at the forest's edge afterward, deliberately far enough from the village that no one bothered making the walk simply to remind her of her place in it. She kept chickens. She kept to herself. She'd decided, somewhere in the 2 quiet years since, that solitude suited her considerably better than the alternative ever had. Then, on a rain-soaked evening in early autumn, she found a wolf collapsed at her garden gate. Enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she'd ever encountered, fur matted with blood from a wound along one flank, golden eyes barely tracking her movement as she knelt beside him. "Well," she said, mostly to fill the silence, since talking to herself had become a habit these past 2 years. "You're either someone's very large pet, or you're about to become my very large problem." The wolf did not answer, being, after all, a wolf. But something in his exhausted gaze seemed to consider the observation carefully before he allowed her, with visible reluctance, to drag him toward her modest barn. She had no earthly idea, that first night, cleaning a wound the size of her forearm by lantern light, while the enormous creature glared at her with wounded, golden-eyed suspicion, that she was about to spend 7 nights nursing something considerably more significant than an injured animal back to health. Or that on the 7th night, the wolf currently drooling on her second-best blanket would stand up, shake himself thoroughly, and turn into the king. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. Bryony had gotten rather good, over 2 years of solitary living, at telling the difference between sounds that mattered and sounds that didn't. Wind rattling the shutters didn't matter. The particular creak her porch step made when the temperature dropped didn't matter. But the low, pained whine that reached her through the rain that evening, carrying just beneath the storm's noise, mattered considerably. She was out the door before she'd properly decided to be, lantern in one hand, the sturdy walking stick she kept by the door in the other, picking her way down the muddy garden path toward the sound. What she found at her gate made her stop dead in her tracks. "Oh," she said, staring, "you're rather larger than I expected." The wolf collapsed against her fence post was, by any reasonable measure, enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she'd encountered in 2 years of forest living, his fur a deep, storm-dark gray matted with blood along one flank where something had clearly torn through muscle with considerable force. His breathing came ragged and shallow, and when his eyes finally focused on her, golden and glazed with pain, something in her chest twisted despite every reasonable instinct telling her to go back inside and pretend she'd seen nothing at all. "This is a terrible idea," she informed him, already setting down her walking stick to examine the wound more closely. "You understand that, don't you? Enormous injured wolf, isolated cottage. No one within screaming distance should you decide I look more appetizing than convalescent." The wolf's ear twitched, the closest thing to a response he seemed capable of managing. "I'm going to take that as agreement," Bryony said. "Purely because the alternative is standing here in the rain arguing ethics with an animal who can't actually argue back." Getting him to the barn proved considerably more difficult than she'd anticipated. The wolf's dead weight testing every ounce of strength 2 years of hauling firewood and hoeing gardens had built into her arms and back. By the time she'd half-dragged, half-coaxed him onto the pile of clean straw she kept for exactly this kind of emergency, though admittedly she'd only ever previously used it for injured chickens and one memorably stubborn goat, she was soaked through and breathing nearly as hard as her patient. "You," she informed him, hands on her hips, surveying the damage, "are going to owe me considerably more than gratitude once you're capable of expressing it." She worked through the worst of the storm by lantern light, cleaning the wound with the same brisk, practical competence she'd developed treating years of smaller forest creatures. Foxes with broken legs, owls with damaged wings, the occasional overly ambitious badger who'd picked a fight it couldn't win. The wolf endured her ministrations with a stillness that struck her, more than once, as almost unnervingly deliberate, as though some part of him understood, clearer than any ordinary animal reasonably should, exactly what she was doing and why it mattered. "There," she said finally, tying off the last of her makeshift bandaging. "That should hold, provided you don't do anything foolish like attempt to run a foot race before it's properly healed." The wolf's tail thumped once against the straw, weak but unmistakable. "I'm choosing to interpret that as thanks," Bryony said, settling back on her heels with considerable exhaustion. "Manners. I like that in a patient, even a four-legged one who could presumably remove my arm without much effort." She checked on him twice more that night, unable to properly sleep with an enormous injured predator recovering in her barn, and found him each time exactly where she'd left him, golden eyes tracking her movement with an alertness that seemed increasingly, considerably too sharp for an ordinary wolf. "You watch me like you understand every word I'm saying," she told him. On her second visit, settling onto an overturned bucket, a safe but companionable distance away. Which would be considerably less unsettling if it weren't, in fact, unsettling. The wolf made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, something closer to amusement, if wolves were capable of amusement, which Bryony was fairly certain they were not. "I've officially lost my mind," she informed the empty barn. Talking to a wolf as though he might respond. Widow Pruitt would have opinions about this if she knew. She thought briefly of walking the half-mile into the village to fetch help. Someone with actual training in large predator care. Someone who might properly assess whether harboring an enormous, unnaturally alert wolf represented genuine danger, rather than simple, exhausted paranoia. But the storm still raged outside, and the wolf's breathing had settled into something steadier. And some part of her, the same stubborn part that had built this entire solitary life out of necessity rather than choice, found she wasn't quite ready to invite the village's judgment back into her carefully protected quiet. "We'll manage without them," she told the wolf, more to convince herself than him. "I've managed considerably worse than this past 2 years." Morning arrived gray and damp. The storm finally spent, and Bryony found the wolf awake and considerably more alert than his condition warranted, watching her approach the barn with an expression she could have sworn carried genuine curiosity. "You look better," she observed, settling in to check his bandaging, which is either an excellent sign or an extremely convincing performance meant to lure me into a false sense of security before you eat my chickens. The wolf's ears flicked toward the sound of her actual chickens, currently making considerable racket in their coop, and something in his golden eyes flickered with what looked, unmistakably, like genuine interest. "Absolutely not," Bryony said firmly. "Those chickens are under my protection, Wolf. You'll have to make do with whatever I bring you directly." She spent the better part of that morning working out a rough system, venison she'd smoked weeks earlier and had no particular attachment to, water carried in a chipped bucket, fresh bandaging changed with considerably more confidence than her first attempt the night before. The wolf accepted her care with the same watchful stillness, occasionally making that low, amused sound whenever she talked to him, which she was slowly realizing with some embarrassment, had become rather more often than strictly necessary. "I've decided you're an excellent listener," she told him around midday, settling in with her mending while he dozed nearby. "Considerably better than the chickens, who mostly just want food and have no interest in my opinions about anything else." The wolf's tail thumped against the straw. "See, that's precisely what I mean. Responsive. I appreciate that in company, even silent, four-legged company recovering from what I strongly suspect was a fairly serious hunting accident. Or possibly a fight with something equally large and considerably less injured than you currently are." It was Widow Pruitt, inevitably, who discovered the arrangement 3 days later, arriving at Bryony's gate with a basket of bread she claimed, with transparent insincerity, to have simply had extra of. "I heard something large moved into your barn," the older woman said, craning her neck to peer past Bryony toward the structure in question. "It's a wolf," Bryony said, deciding honesty was considerably less exhausting than inventing an alternative explanation. "Injured. I'm nursing him back to health." Widow Pruitt's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "A wolf, in your barn, living with you. Recovering in my barn. There's a meaningful distinction." "Is there?" The older woman's eyes glinted with the particular delight of a woman who considered gossip a civic responsibility. "Because from where I'm standing, dear, that sounds like precisely the kind of story this village hasn't had in considerable years." "It's not a story, Widow Pruitt. It's an injured animal receiving basic care." The older woman didn't look remotely convinced. "Well, do be careful, dear. Wolves that size don't typically wander this close to settled land without reason. I'd hate for your kindness to cost you more than it's worth." The warning lingered with her rather longer than she wanted to admit, following her back toward the barn where her patient waited. "She thinks you're dangerous," Bryony informed him. "I told her you're simply injured, though I confess, watching you watch me right now, I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps we're both partially correct." That evening, once Widow Pruitt had finally departed, Bryony found herself lingering in the barn longer than strictly necessary, mending Forgotten in her lap. "I should tell you," she said eventually, "since you can't very well repeat it to anyone, that I wasn't always quite this isolated. There was a pack once. Rejected Omega," she continued, the old bitterness worn smooth enough now to say plainly. "Publicly, formally, in front of the entire gathered pack, because apparently my particular gift, animals mostly, an unusual ability to calm and heal creatures other Omegas found simply frightening, wasn't the kind of gift anyone considered properly valuable." The wolf shifted, careful of his healing wound, and pressed his great head gently against her knee. "That's a remarkably human thing for a wolf to do," she said, voice unsteady. He simply looked at her, golden eyes warm despite everything, and Bryony found herself, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, considerably less lonely that evening than she'd felt in longer than 2 solitary years combined. "6 more nights of this," she told him, scratching gently behind one torn ear. "And then presumably you'll be well enough to return to wherever enormous, uncannily attentive wolves properly belong. I confess I'm not entirely certain how I feel about that timeline." The wolf's tail thumped once, soft and unhurried, against the straw, and Bryony, watching the gesture, decided not to examine too closely why the thought of his eventual departure had settled somewhere considerably heavier in her chest than simple, practical concern for an injured animal's welfare ever should. By the second night, Bryony had developed what she privately considered a rather sensible routine. Check the wound at dusk, bring fresh water, settle in with her mending while the wolf dozed, and studiously avoid examining why she'd started looking forward to the barn considerably more than her own quiet cottage. "You're better company than I expected," she told him, threading a needle by lantern light. "Though admittedly my standards for company have grown rather generous these past 2 years." The wolf's ear flicked toward her, attentive as always, and she'd nearly convinced herself that particular attentiveness was simply her own imagination working overtime on an otherwise unremarkable animal, when he did something that made her needle clatter entirely out of her hands. He nudged the mending basket toward her with his nose. "That's..." She stared at the basket, then at him, then back at the basket. "That's considerably too deliberate a gesture for an ordinary wolf, wouldn't you agree?" The wolf held her gaze, golden eyes steady, and made no attempt whatsoever to deny it. "Right." Bryony sat back slowly, old instinct warring with the sheer impossible strangeness of the moment. "You understand me, properly." Not simply reacting to tone of voice, the way a clever dog might, but actually understanding the words themselves. The wolf's head dipped once, unmistakably, deliberately, a nod. I've spent 2 nights telling an apparently sentient wolf entirely too much about my personal history, Bryony said, feeling heat crawl up her neck at the realization. The rejection, the Omega gift nobody wanted. All of it, delivered to what I assumed was a simple, uncomprehending animal. The wolf made that low, amused sound again. The one she'd been telling herself for 2 days wasn't actually laughter, because wolves didn't laugh. Except, apparently, this one very much did. "This isn't funny," she informed him, though her own mouth had begun twitching despite her best effort to maintain proper dignity. "This is deeply unsettling. Are you a shifter? Is that what's happening here? Some enormous injured shifter who's simply chosen not to mention it because watching me embarrass myself is more entertaining than clarifying the situation?" The wolf's tail thumped against the straw, which she was increasingly certain constituted agreement. "You absolute menace," Bryony said, though there was no real heat in it. 2 days, and you let me carry on like a woman losing her mind talking to livestock." She spent the following hour interrogating him properly, working out a rough system of tail thumps for yes and stillness for no, growing steadily more delighted despite herself with how quickly they developed something resembling actual conversation. "Are you from a pack near here?" 1 thump. "Local, then." "Do I know your alpha?" A pause, then 2 thumps in quick succession, which she decided, after some negotiation, meant complicated. "That's not a proper answer." The wolf's ears flattened slightly, the closest thing to an eye roll she'd witnessed from an animal, and Bryony laughed properly for what felt like the first time in longer than she wanted to examine. "Fine. Complicated. I'll allow it, for now, given your current condition doesn't particularly favor extended interrogation." She settled back against the barn wall, studying him with fresh curiosity, now that the strangeness of the past 2 days had resolved into something considerably more interesting than simple veterinary care. "Can you shift back? Right now, I mean? Or does the wound prevent it?" 1 thump, then a pause, then a low, frustrated sound that needed no translation whatsoever. "The wound prevents it. That's unfortunate, though I confess I'm rather curious what you look like properly. Assuming you're not simply going to remain an enormous, opinionated wolf indefinitely?" The wolf's golden eyes flickered with something that looked, unmistakably, like mischief, and Bryony found herself wondering, not for the first time that evening, exactly what kind of man she'd been housing in her barn for 2 days without the faintest idea. Widow Pruitt returned the following afternoon, ostensibly to check on Bryony's recovery from what she diplomatically termed the shock of harboring dangerous wildlife, though her actual interest in gathering fresh gossip material remained considerably less subtle than she likely believed. "He's healing well," Bryony reported, before the older woman could properly begin her fishing expedition. "I expect he'll be fully recovered within the week. And then, presumably, he returns to wherever he came from." Bryony said it lightly, though something in her chest tightened at the words that she wasn't entirely prepared to examine. Widow Pruitt studied her with the particular sharp attention of a woman who'd spent decades reading exactly what people didn't say aloud. "You've grown fond of him. He's an interesting patient." "That's not what I asked, dear." Bryony busied herself with unnecessary tidying rather than properly answer, and Widow Pruitt, with surprising tact for a woman whose primary hobby was village gossip, allowed the subject to drop, though not without a knowing look that suggested the matter was far from properly settled in her own mind. "There's been talk," the older woman said instead, "of the king's men searching the eastern forests. Some manner of hunting accident apparently, though details remain scarce. A member of the royal guard, injured and separated from his party during a boar hunt gone wrong." Something in Bryony's stomach dropped uncomfortably. "The eastern forests. That's rather close to here." "Close enough that I thought you'd want to know, given your current guest's rather significant size and rather significant wound. Widow Pruitt's eyes glinted with fresh, delighted speculation. Wouldn't that be a story, dear? The wolf witch of the forest's edge, nursing the king's own missing guard back to health. He's not the king's guard, Bryony said, though considerably less certainty than she intended crept into her voice. No, Widow Pruitt agreed, entirely too pleased with herself. I imagine he's not. Bryony returned to the barn that evening with Widow Pruitt's report weighing considerably heavier on her mind than she wanted to admit, and found the wolf watching her approach with what she was beginning to recognize as genuine, careful attention. There's talk in the village, she said, settling beside him without her usual preamble. The king's men searching these forests, a guard, injured during a hunting accident, separated from his party. The wolf went very still. That's you, isn't it? It wasn't really a question. One slow thump, considerably more subdued than his usual enthusiastic responses. Why haven't you told me? I could have sent word, gotten you proper help days ago, instead of muddling through with whatever herbs and bandages I happen to have available. The wolf made a low, complicated sound and nudged toward her hand with his nose. An apology, she realized, or something close enough to one that the gesture needed no further translation. I'm not angry, she said, softening, simply confused. If you're a king's guard, surely there are considerably better resources available to you than my modest barn and my rather limited veterinary knowledge. The wolf's golden eyes held hers for a long moment, something in his expression carrying weight she couldn't properly interpret without words to accompany it. And Bryony found herself, unexpectedly, wishing rather fiercely that his wound would simply hurry up and heal enough to let him shift, so she might finally understand exactly what he was so clearly trying and failing to properly communicate. 7 nights, she said finally, remembering the timeline she'd estimated for his recovery. I suppose I'll simply have to wait and ask you properly once you're capable of actual conversation, rather than tail thumps and meaningful looks. The wolf's tail thumped once, agreement, and he settled his great head against her knee again, the same gesture from 2 nights earlier that had struck her, even then as considerably too deliberate for simple animal comfort-seeking. Whoever you are, Bryony said quietly, scratching gently behind his torn ear. I confess I'm rather looking forward to finding out properly. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Bryony found herself turning over the accumulated strangeness of the past 3 days. An enormous, clearly sentient wolf, apparently connected somehow to the king's own royal guard, recovering in her barn while she'd spent considerable hours confessing her entire painful history to what she'd assumed was simple, uncomprehending company. She thought of Widow Pruitt's knowing look, the older woman's uncanny ability to spot exactly what Bryony herself had been carefully avoiding acknowledging. You've grown fond of him. It was, she admitted to the darkness of her small bedroom, entirely too accurate an observation for comfort. 3 days, and already she found herself dreading the eventual morning when the wolf's wound would heal sufficiently for him to simply rise, shake himself off, and disappear back toward whatever royal life awaited him, leaving her alone again with her chickens and her carefully rebuilt solitude. This is precisely the kind of foolishness that gets a person's heart properly broken, she informed her ceiling, with the particular firmness of someone trying rather hard to convince herself of something she didn't fully believe. 4 days of acquaintance, most of it conducted through tail thumps, and already you're moping about his eventual departure like a lovesick girl half your maturity. Her ceiling, unhelpfully, offered no counter-argument. She fell asleep eventually, mind still circling the mystery of golden eyes and deliberate gestures, and whatever complicated truth waited behind 7 nights she'd somehow, impossibly, already begun counting down with something considerably more significant than simple veterinary curiosity. Morning brought fresh rain, and Bryony found herself grateful for the excuse to spend the day close to the barn rather than tending her garden properly, though she told herself this had everything to do with practical concerns about her patient catching a chill and nothing whatsoever to do with simply wanting his company. "I've been thinking," she announced, arriving with breakfast and considerably more curiosity than she'd managed to suppress overnight. "About the Royal Guard business. If your party's searching for you, surely they'll eventually search this close to the village." The wolf's ears pricked with interest. "Should I send word? I could walk to the village crossroads, leave some manner of signal for search parties, though I confess I'm not entirely certain what signal one uses to indicate large sentient wolf, recovering nicely. Please don't storm my barn with weapons drawn." A low, amused huff answered that, and one deliberate shake of his great head. "No signal, then. You'd rather wait out the full recovery here." One thump. "That's rather trusting of you, given we've known each other exactly 4 days and most of our conversation has consisted of you thumping a tail at increasingly specific questions." The wolf's golden eyes softened, something in the expression carrying warmth that needed no tail thump translation whatsoever, and Bryony felt her own breath catch slightly at the directness of it. "Well," she said, clearing her throat and busying herself with unnecessary bandage checking to cover the sudden, unexpected flutter in her chest. "I suppose 4 days is rather sufficient time to establish trust, under sufficiently unusual circumstances." She spent the remainder of that rainy morning in companionable near silence, mending forgotten entirely in favor of simply sitting beside him, occasionally asking questions he answered with his increasingly expressive repertoire of thumps and huffs and considering silences, and found herself, by midday, laughing properly at what had somehow become an actual conversation, despite one participant's continued inability to form actual words. "3 more nights," she said eventually, watching him doze in the gray afternoon light. "I confess I'm developing rather complicated feelings about that particular countdown, Wolf, whoever you turn out to be." The wolf, apparently already asleep, offered no response at all, though his tail, even in sleep, gave one soft, unmistakable thump against the straw. Bryony smiled, gathered her forgotten mending, and left him to rest, already dreading, however foolishly, the eventual morning when 3 nights would become none at all. The 5th night arrived with considerably more tension than the previous 4 combined. Bryony's careful routine disrupted by a sound she'd been half dreading since Widow Pruitt's report. Horses, several of them, moving through the forest with the particular purposeful urgency of an organized search. "That's them," she said, dropping to her knees beside the wolf, voice pitched low despite the distance. "The search party, they're close." The wolf's ears swiveled toward the sound, his whole body going tense and alert despite his still healing wound. "Do you want me to signal them? Now. I mean, properly, rather than waiting out the remaining 2 nights." The wolf considered this with visible deliberation, then shook his head firmly. "You're certain? I don't fully understand the reluctance, given you're apparently quite important enough to warrant an organized search." The wolf made a low, complicated sound, and nudged his nose toward her hand, then toward himself, then back toward her. A gesture she'd learned, over 5 days of increasingly sophisticated communication, generally meant something like this: "Here matters more right now. You'd rather stay with me, rather than return immediately to whatever royal life is currently searching these woods for you." One decisive thump. Bryony felt something warm and terrified bloom in her chest simultaneously. The particular vertigo of understanding a feeling was mutual before she'd properly admitted to herself what that feeling actually was. "That's remarkably flattering," she said, voice unsteady, "and also entirely impractical. Given they're your search party and presumably have resources considerably better suited to your recovery than my modest barn." The wolf's golden eyes held hers, steady and certain despite his inability to properly argue the point verbally. and something in that steady gaze conveyed, more clearly than words might have managed, exactly how little he cared about resources or practicality in that particular moment. The search party passed within a quarter-mile of her cottage that night, close enough that Bryony held her breath until the sound of hooves and distant voices finally faded, and found herself, once the danger had passed, laughing rather helplessly at the absurdity of hiding an entire Royal Search's object in her own modest barn. "I've become a criminal," she informed the wolf, settling back down beside him once the danger had properly passed. "Harboring a fugitive from his own rescue party. Widow Pruitt would have considerable opinions about this, were she not thankfully asleep several fields away." The wolf's tail thumped, entirely unrepentant. "You're not even slightly sorry, are you?" Another thump, this one almost cheerful. "I should be furious with you. Instead, I find myself considerably more concerned about what happens once you're finally capable of proper speech, and this entire arrangement becomes considerably harder to justify to whoever comes looking next." The wolf shifted, pressing close against her side despite his healing wound, and Bryony found herself leaning into the warmth of him without properly deciding to, the last of the evening's tension easing into something quieter and considerably more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. "2 more nights," she said softly, mostly to herself. "I keep telling myself that's not very much time at all, and somehow it feels like entirely too little regardless." Dr. Aldrich, the village's aging physician, whom Bryony had reluctantly consulted the following morning under the pretense of asking about general wound care for a large dog, proved rather less easily fooled than she'd hoped. "A large dog," he repeated, peering at her over his spectacles with open skepticism. "Bryony, dear, I've lived in this village considerably longer than you've been alive. I'm aware of precisely what's been keeping half the village gossiping this past week. It's genuinely just an injured wolf, doctor. Nothing more complicated than that." He didn't look remotely convinced, though he offered his professional advice regardless. Proper poultices for deep muscle wounds, warning signs of infection to watch for, the particular timeline large predators generally required for full recovery. Though I'll say this, dear, entirely as a friend rather than a physician. Whatever's actually living in your barn, be careful. Wolves that size, appearing precisely when the King's Guard reports a missing man during a hunting accident. That's not the kind of coincidence a sensible woman ignores. "I'm being careful," Bryony said, though something in her chest tightened at his implicit warning. "Careful with your safety, certainly. I'm equally concerned about your heart, given the particular expression you're currently failing to properly hide." Dr. Aldrich's weathered face softened with genuine affection. "You've been alone a long while, Bryony. I understand the appeal of unexpected company, particularly company that can't yet properly disappoint you with words. But whatever this creature turns out to be, human or otherwise, I'd hate to see you hurt by hoping for something that mysterious circumstances rarely deliver honestly." The warning followed her home considerably more persistently than she wanted to admit. Old caution warring with 5 days of steadily building affection she'd been trying, with limited success, to properly rationalize as simple veterinary attachment. She found the wolf restless that evening, pacing his small enclosure with obvious frustration despite his healing wound, and settled in beside him with fresh concern. "What's wrong? Has something changed?" The wolf's golden eyes carried something she hadn't seen from him before. Urgency, perhaps, or frustration at his continued inability to properly communicate whatever weighed on him. "I wish you could simply tell me," she said softly. "Whatever's troubling you tonight." The wolf pressed his nose against her palm, then drew back slightly, then repeated the gesture. Insistent, deliberate, clearly trying to convey something considerably more complex than his usual thumps could manage. "You're trying to tell me something important." A firm thump. "About yourself? About what happens once you're healed?" Another thump, followed by a low, frustrated whine that made her chest ache with sympathy. "I wish I understood," Bryony said, pressing her forehead gently against his. Whatever it is, I hope it's not goodbye disguised as something else. I don't think I'm prepared for that particular conversation yet, even through tail thumps." The wolf went very still at that, something in his posture shifting into a kind of careful, deliberate stillness, and when he finally moved again, it was to press his great head firmly against her chest, directly over her racing heart, in a gesture that needed absolutely no translation at all. "Oh!" Bryony breathed, understanding dawning slow and warm despite her better judgment's continued protests. "That's not goodbye at all, is it?" The wolf's tail thumped once, soft and certain, and Bryony, despite every sensible warning Dr. Aldrich had offered that same morning, found herself leaning into the moment rather than retreating from it. That night, once she'd finally retreated to her own bed, Bryony lay awake turning over the accumulated evidence of the past 5 days. The deliberate gestures, the careful attentiveness, the way his golden eyes seemed to carry entire conversations she couldn't properly access. And beneath all of it, something that felt increasingly, undeniably, like genuine affection reflected back at her from an enormous, currently wordless wolf. "This is entirely mad," she informed her ceiling for the second time that week. "I've fallen for a creature I've known 5 days, most of that time spent interpreting tail thumps as though they constitute proper courtship." Her ceiling, as always, offered no particular wisdom on the matter. "And yet," she continued, quieter now, "I find myself rather unable to properly regret it, whatever foolishness this eventually proves to be." 2 nights remained before his wound would properly heal enough for shifting, according to her own rough calculations, and Bryony found herself, for the first time in 2 carefully solitary years, genuinely uncertain whether she was more frightened of what those 2 remaining nights might reveal, or of losing whatever fragile, wordless connection they'd built once actual words finally became available to complicate it. She fell asleep eventually, dreaming of golden eyes and gentle gestures, and woke the following morning with considerably more resolve than uncertainty, determined to face whatever the final nights revealed with the same stubborn courage that had carried her through 2 years of solitary rebuilding. Whatever waited on the other side of his recovery, Kingsguard, complicated obligations, or something else entirely she hadn't yet properly imagined, she found she'd rather face it honestly than continue pretending her heart hadn't already, thoroughly, made its own decision on the matter. Morning arrived clear and bright for the first time in nearly a week, and Bryony found the wolf waiting for her at the barn door rather than settled in his usual straw nest, standing with considerably more strength than his wound ought to have properly allowed. "You're supposed to be resting," she said, though her scolding carried little real conviction against the sight of him steady on his feet, golden eyes bright and alert in the morning light. The wolf huffed, unbothered, and nudged gently at her hand before turning to lead her, with obvious purpose, toward the small clearing behind her cottage, where wildflowers had begun their late-season bloom. "You're taking me somewhere," she observed, following with growing curiosity. "That's new. Usually I'm the one making the decisions around here." He led her to the clearing's center, settled himself carefully in the soft grass, and patted the ground beside him with one enormous paw, an invitation so clear it needed no tail thump translation at all. Bryony settled beside him, and for a long while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, morning sun warming her shoulders, the wolf's steady presence beside her considerably more soothing than she wanted to properly examine. "I could grow rather used to mornings like this," she admitted eventually, "which is precisely the kind of dangerous thought Dr. Aldrich warned me against yesterday." The wolf's ear flicked toward her, curious. "He's worried I'm setting myself up for heartbreak, falling for mysterious circumstances that rarely deliver what they promise." She plucked a wildflower, turning it absently in her fingers. "I told him I was being careful. I'm not entirely certain that was true, even as I said it." The wolf pressed close against her side, warm and solid and entirely too comforting for a creature she'd known less than a week, and Bryony found herself leaning into him without further protest, old caution finally, quietly surrendering to something she'd stopped properly fighting sometime around the fourth night. "One more night," she said softly, watching a bee investigate the wildflower in her hand. "I confess I've stopped dreading it quite so thoroughly, and started rather foolishly looking forward to whatever comes after." The wolf's tail thumped once against the grass, warm and certain, and together they watched the morning unfold, golden light and quiet company, and the particular, fragile hope of 2 more days becoming, at long last, exactly 1. That evening, Widow Pruitt appeared once more at the garden gate, this time without any pretense of bread or errands, simply settling herself on the fence post with the particular satisfaction of a woman who intended to properly witness whatever came next. "I've decided," she announced, "that I'm not leaving until I see how this particular story ends." "There's no story, Widow Pruitt." "Dear," the older woman said, not unkindly, "I've buried 2 husbands and outlived considerably more gossip than you've had years on this earth. I know precisely what a woman looks like when she's fallen for something she shouldn't have, and you, my girl, have that look plastered across your whole face." She settled more comfortably against the fence. "So I'll simply wait here, quietly, and mind my own business exactly as much as I ever do, which is to say, not remotely." Bryony opened her mouth to protest, caught the wolf's low, amused huff from the barn, and found she couldn't properly argue against either of them. "One more night," she said instead, mostly to herself, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the tree line. "Whatever tomorrow brings, I suppose we'll all 3 of us find out together." The 6th night arrived quieter than any of the preceding ones, Widow Pruitt having finally retreated to her own cottage after Bryony's 3rd firm insistence that nothing scandalous was presently occurring in the barn, and the forest settling into the particular hush that precedes a change in weather. "You're healing well," Bryony observed, checking the wound one final time by lantern light, finding the torn flesh knitted considerably more than she'd expected given the timeline. "Dr. Aldrich's poultice recommendation seems to have done its work properly." The wolf's tail thumped, though his golden eyes carried something restless she hadn't seen from him before, a kind of anticipatory tension that made her own pulse quicken in response. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "That's when you'll be able to shift, isn't it?" "Properly, I mean, not simply attempting it before the wound's fully closed." One slow, deliberate thump. "I confess I've spent considerable time these past 2 days wondering exactly who I've been keeping company with." She settled beside him, tucking her knees up against the evening chill. "A king's guard, apparently. Though I find myself wondering whether that's the whole truth, or simply the version easiest to explain through tail thumps." The wolf went very still, something careful and deliberate in his stillness that made her stomach flutter with fresh uncertainty. "That's not the whole truth, is it?" A single slow thump, considerably more hesitant than his usual responses. "I see." Bryony turned this over carefully, old caution warring with the steady, accumulated trust of 6 days spent in increasingly intimate company. "Well, whatever you're not telling me, I imagine I'll learn it properly tomorrow, one way or another. I'd rather hear it from you directly than have it delivered by an entire search party storming my garden." The wolf pressed close against her side, and Bryony, despite the fresh uncertainty his hesitation had stirred, found herself leaning into the warmth of him without reservation. "Whatever you are," she said softly, "I've rather thoroughly decided these past 6 days that it doesn't change how I feel about the company you've kept me. I hope that proves true tomorrow as well, regardless of whatever complications your actual identity brings with it." Sleep proved elusive that night, and Bryony found herself, well past midnight, still turning over every small detail of the past 6 days that might have hinted at the truth she suspected now hovered just beyond tomorrow's reveal. The way he carried himself, even injured, with a bearing that seemed considerably too dignified for an ordinary guard. The particular quality of command in his stillness, the sense that even wordless he expected, and generally received, her full attention. The care he'd taken, even through simple tail thumps, never once demanding anything, only asking, gently, in whatever limited way remained available to him. A guard wouldn't move quite like that, she murmured to her ceiling, old habit reasserting itself despite the late hour. Someone considerably more important than a guard then, a captain perhaps, or something more. She thought of the formal portraits she'd glimpsed exactly twice in her life, once as a child visiting the market town with her mother, once during the brief, painful weeks before her rejection when she'd still believed herself destined for a proper place within pack society. Golden-eyed, dark-haired, the particular commanding bearing that even a formal painting couldn't fully soften. The thought arrived and departed too quickly for her to properly examine it, dismissed as impossible before she'd given it fair consideration, and she finally drifted toward uneasy sleep with the mystery still fully unresolved. She woke before dawn, restless with anticipation she couldn't properly name, and found the wolf already awake when she arrived at the barn, standing with a strength and steadiness that suggested his recovery had, overnight, reached some final threshold. "You look different," she observed, studying him carefully. "More yourself, somehow, though I confess, that's a strange thing to say about a wolf." The wolf's golden eyes held hers, warm and steady, and for the first time in 6 days, she thought she saw something like nervousness flicker across his otherwise composed expression. "Are you nervous? About shifting, I mean, or about whatever comes after?" A slow, considering pause, then one thump. "Both, then." She managed a small, encouraging smile, despite her own considerable nervousness. "That's fair. I confess I'm rather nervous myself, and I'm not even the one about to undergo a rather significant physical transformation." The wolf huffed, something almost like amusement breaking through his tension, and settled himself into a patch of morning sun with visible effort at patience. "Not yet, then. The wound needs another full day, doesn't it?" One thump, apologetic. "That's quite all right. I've waited 6 days already. One more won't properly kill me, whatever my own nervousness currently suggests otherwise." The final day of waiting passed with an odd suspended quality, Bryony finding herself unable to properly settle into any of her usual routines, and the wolf, for his part, seeming equally restless despite his obvious effort to remain calm for her benefit. "I keep imagining all the possibilities," she admitted, midway through an afternoon spent mostly failing to properly tend her garden. "Some minor lord's son, perhaps, or a captain of the guard, someone with enough standing to warrant an organized search, but not so much standing that the eventual reveal becomes entirely overwhelming." The wolf made a low, non-committal sound. "That's not remotely reassuring." Another low sound, this one carrying something that might have been apology. "Well, whatever you turn out to be, I've decided I'd rather know properly than continue guessing indefinitely. Tomorrow can't arrive quickly enough, honestly, nerves notwithstanding." She busied herself that afternoon with unnecessary preparations, sweeping the barn considerably more thoroughly than 7 days of dust properly warranted, arranging what little proper food remained in her pantry as though expecting a guest of genuine consequence, and pointedly ignoring the small, insistent voice suggesting she already half suspected precisely how consequential her guest actually was. Widow Pruitt appeared briefly that afternoon as well, delivering fresh bread with rather less pretense than her usual visits. "Tomorrow, is it?" the older woman said, studying Bryony's obvious nerves with knowing satisfaction. "The final night. How did you know?" "Village gossip, dear, travels considerably faster than sense, as I've mentioned before. Word is the search parties narrowed their range to precisely this stretch of forest. Whatever's healing in your barn, someone important enough to warrant that much continued searching isn't likely a simple guardsman." Bryony felt her stomach tighten at the confirmation of her own growing suspicion. "You think it's someone significant?" I think, dear, that you'd best prepare yourself for considerably more than you've been imagining. Widow Pruitt's teasing softened into something gentler. Whatever tomorrow reveals, I hope it doesn't cost you the particular happiness I've watched grow in you this past week. You deserve that happiness properly, whatever complications arrive alongside it. The older woman departed before Bryony could properly formulate a response, leaving her with considerably more to consider than the breadbasket alone accounted for. She spent that final evening in the barn beside the wolf, mending forgotten entirely in favor of simply talking, about her childhood before the rejection, about the particular satisfaction of building something entirely her own from nothing, about the quiet loneliness she'd carefully constructed into something resembling contentment these past 2 years, and how thoroughly 6 days of his company had disrupted that careful contentment in ways she was still properly processing. "I don't regret it," she said finally, as the evening settled into full darkness. "Whatever tomorrow reveals, I want that said plainly, before everything potentially becomes considerably more complicated." The wolf pressed his great head against her chest again, that same gesture from 2 nights earlier, steady and warm and needing no translation whatsoever, and Bryony, settling into the barn straw beside him for what she suspected would be their final night as simply woman and wolf, found herself falling asleep considerably more peacefully than her earlier nervousness had suggested possible. The 7th night arrived with a full moon breaking clear through scattered clouds, silver light spilling through the barn's open door in a way that struck Bryony, waking to find the wolf already alert and watching her, as almost deliberately theatrical. "Tonight," she said, sitting up properly, heart already racing with anticipation she couldn't fully separate from nervousness. The wolf rose to his feet, testing his weight carefully, and Bryony watched him move through the barn with a fluid steadiness that confirmed, more clearly than any words could have, that his healing had finally, properly completed. "You're certain? I don't want you forcing this before you're truly ready, simply because 7 nights felt like a significant enough number to warrant the attempt." The wolf's golden eyes met hers, steady and certain, and he gave one final decisive thump before settling into a low crouch in the center of the barn floor. What followed happened faster than Bryony's mind properly processed, a shimmer of moonlight catching fur that seemed suddenly to ripple and shift like water, bones audibly reshaping beneath skin that stretched and reformed with a speed that should have looked considerably more painful than it apparently was. The wolf's entire massive form folding inward and upward until, where an enormous gray wolf had crouched only moments before, a man now knelt instead, breathing hard, dark hair damp with the effort of transformation, broad shoulders catching the silver moonlight. Bryony's breath caught entirely. He was, by any reasonable measure, remarkably handsome, strong-jawed, golden-eyed exactly as his wolf form had been, with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to command even in this vulnerable, newly shifted moment. But it was his face, once he finally lifted it to meet her gaze properly, that made her heart stop entirely. She recognized him. Not personally, not from any previous acquaintance, but from the formal portrait that hung in every village hall throughout the kingdom, from coins bearing his profile, from 2 years of careful, deliberate avoidance of anything connected to royal court or formal pack politics. "You're the king," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You're King Cassian." The king, Cassian apparently, now that he possessed proper words rather than tail thumps, managed a rueful, entirely undignified laugh despite his obvious exhaustion. "I confess I'd hoped for a slightly more dramatic reveal than simple recognition, given 7 nights of build-up." "You're the king," Bryony repeated, still working through the sheer scope of the revelation. "I've been housing the king of the entire realm in my barn. I've been telling the king my entire personal history while he sat there thumping his tail like an overgrown dog. In my defense, I rather enjoyed hearing it." "That's not remotely the point, Cassian." She stopped abruptly, horrified. "Your Majesty. I should be calling you Your Majesty, presumably, rather than simply your given name like we're old friends. I'd very much prefer Cassian, actually, given the particular intimacy of the past 7 nights. He rose slowly, testing his newly human legs with visible effort, and Bryony realized with fresh mortification that he was entirely unclothed, the transformation having left him with nothing beyond bare, moonlit skin and an expression of dawning, equally mortified realization. "Oh," she said, spinning around immediately, cheeks flaming. "Oh, I should fetch you something. Clothing. Immediately." "That would be appreciated," Cassian said, and she could hear the laughter barely contained in his voice despite his own evident embarrassment. "Though I confess this isn't precisely how I imagined our first proper conversation unfolding either." She returned moments later with an old shirt and trousers that had belonged once to a father she barely remembered, considerably too large for Cassian's broad frame but sufficient for basic decency, and found him seated on an overturned crate, looking simultaneously regal and thoroughly out of place in her modest barn. "Better," she said, still not quite able to meet his eyes properly. "Though I confess I'm still considerably more overwhelmed than I'd like to admit. May I explain properly? I've had 7 nights to prepare what I wanted to say, though admittedly most of that preparation happened while unable to actually say anything at all. Please." Cassian gestured for her to sit, and once she'd settled across from him, considerably more composed than her racing heart properly warranted, he began. "I was separated from my hunting party during a boar hunt, exactly as the rumors suggested, though the injury was considerably worse than simple bad luck implies. There was an attempt on my life, Bryony. An arrow, meant for a boar according to whoever loosed it, that found me instead during the chaos of the hunt. I don't yet know whether it was genuine accident or deliberate attempt, though I confess I have my suspicions given certain political tensions currently simmering within my own council. That's considerably more alarming than a simple hunting accident." "Considerably," he agreed grimly. "I managed to shift and flee before whoever fired that arrow could finish what they'd started, running until my strength gave out entirely at your garden gate. I didn't shift back immediately upon waking in your care because I genuinely wasn't certain, that first night, whether you were somehow connected to whoever wanted me dead, or simply an innocent woman who'd stumbled into considerably more danger than she properly understood. You suspected me, briefly, for perhaps the first hour, before your genuine kindness made suspicion feel considerably more foolish than caution warranted." Something warm entered his expression despite the grim subject. "After that first hour, I confess my continued silence had rather less to do with suspicion and considerably more to do with simple, selfish enjoyment of your company, unfiltered by whatever performance being properly king typically requires." Bryony felt her cheeks warm further. "You mean you could have shifted back sooner and simply chose not to?" "The wound genuinely did require the full 7 days to properly heal for safe shifting," Cassian said, something sheepish entering his expression. "But I confess I wasn't entirely unhappy about the timeline, given what those 7 days allowed me to learn about you, unguarded by whatever performance my actual identity might have provoked." "That's rather manipulative, Your Majesty." "Cassian," he corrected gently, "and I'd argue it's rather less manipulative than simply honest about wanting to know you properly, without my crown complicating everything from the very first moment." They sat together in comfortable, if considerably charged silence for a long moment, the full weight of the revelation settling slowly into something Bryony could properly process. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "You're the king. Presumably an entire kingdom currently believes you missing, possibly dead, and considerable political business awaits your urgent return." "It does," Cassian admitted, "though I confess I find myself considerably less eager to rush back toward it than duty properly demands." "Because of the attempted assassination?" "Partially, though equally," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "Because returning means this particular chapter. You, this barn, 7 nights of the most genuine company I've experienced in considerably longer than I care to admit, comes to whatever conclusion duty and politics ultimately allow it. You're saying you don't want to leave? I'm saying, Cassian said carefully, that I've spent 7 years as king surrounded by careful performance and calculated flattery, and 7 days as an injured wolf experiencing something I'd nearly forgotten was possible, genuine, unguarded connection, offered without any awareness of my crown to complicate it. I'm not eager to simply abandon that discovery the moment my wound properly heals. Bryony studied him, old caution warring gently with 7 days of steadily building affection that had, apparently, survived even the revelation of his true, considerably complicated identity. I don't know what to properly do with that admission, Cassian. I'm an Omega the Pack rejected, living a quiet, solitary life at the forest's edge. I'm hardly suited to whatever complicated royal life your actual position demands. I'd argue you're precisely suited to it, Cassian said, something fierce and certain entering his voice. You nursed an injured stranger back to health without knowing his identity, expecting nothing in return beyond simple decency. You spoke to me honestly about your genuine fears and hurts, without performing anything for royal benefit. That's rather more rare and valuable than any traditional courtly training could properly teach. That's generous, though I confess considerably premature given we've known each other exactly 7 days, most of which I spent believing you an actual wolf. Then let's take considerably more time, Cassian said, something warm and patient in his golden eyes. I won't pretend the coming days will be simple, given the assassination attempt and whatever political complications my return properly demands. But I find myself entirely unwilling to simply walk away from what these 7 nights revealed, whatever complications remain to be properly navigated. It was then that a fresh sound reached them from beyond the barn. Horses, considerably closer this time than the previous night's search party, and voices calling something that carried unmistakable urgency. They've found the trail properly this time, Cassian said, rising quickly, old instinct sharpening his expression into something considerably more commanding than the vulnerable, newly shifted man of moments earlier. My own guard, most likely, having finally narrowed their search close enough to this cottage. Should I hide you? There's still time, if— No, Cassian said, gentler now, taking her hand. It's time I properly returned, Bryony. Though I promise you this isn't goodbye, whatever it might currently look like. The barn door swung open moments later, and a broad-shouldered man in Royal Guard livery stood silhouetted against the moonlight, sword already half-drawn before recognition dawned across his weathered face. Your Majesty. The relief in the guard's voice was immediate and profound, sword lowering entirely as he crossed the barn floor, dropping to one knee. We feared the worst, sire. A full week searching, and no sign. I'm considerably more alive than the search's length likely suggested you'd find me, Captain Hale, Cassian said, something warm and wry entering his voice despite the gravity of the moment. Though I owe my continued survival entirely to the woman standing beside me. Captain Hale's eyes shifted toward Bryony properly for the first time, assessing, though his expression carried genuine gratitude rather than the wariness she'd half expected. My lady. The kingdom owes you considerable thanks, whatever your role in his recovery. I simply did what any decent person would, Bryony said, feeling suddenly acutely aware of her simple, worn dress and unkempt hair, standing before Royal Guard and revealed king alike. You did rather more than that, Cassian said firmly, and I intend to see that properly recognized, whatever protest you're currently preparing to offer. The following hour passed in a blur of formal reports, careful questioning about the attempted assassination's circumstances, and considerable, barely contained excitement among the guard party at their king's safe recovery. Bryony found herself standing somewhat apart from the proceedings, watching Cassian transform. Even in simple borrowed clothes, into something considerably more commanding and formal than the wounded wolf she'd nursed these past 7 nights. This is who he actually is, she thought, watching him issue calm, decisive orders to his assembled guard. Not simply the gentle, patient companion of these 7 nights, but this as well, a king, born to command, entirely capable of the authority his position demands. The thought settled uneasily alongside her growing affection, old insecurity whispering that whatever connection they'd built through tail thumps and quiet barn conversations might not properly survive contact with the full, considerable weight of his actual royal life. Cassian seemed to sense her retreat, breaking briefly from his guard's urgent questions to cross back toward her. "You've gone quiet," he observed. "I'm simply watching you become someone rather different than the wolf I've spent 7 nights with." "I'm not different," Cassian said firmly. "Simply more fully myself, with proper words available rather than tail thumps alone. The man who valued your company these past 7 nights is precisely the same man currently issuing these orders, whatever additional complexity my actual position requires. That's easy to say tonight, surrounded by grateful guards and dramatic moonlight. Then let me prove it considerably less easily," Cassian said, something determined entering his expression. "Come to the capital. Not immediately, not before you're properly ready, but soon. Let me show you the man behind the crown, in circumstances rather less dramatic than tonight's reveal, and decide for yourself whether that man's worth the complications my actual life demands." Bryony studied him a long moment, old caution warring against the accumulated evidence of 7 remarkable nights, and found herself, despite every sensible reservation, nodding slowly. "I'll consider it," she said, "properly, once I've had time to process everything tonight's revealed." "That's all I'm asking," Cassian said, something warm and grateful in his expression. "Time, and the chance to properly prove what these 7 nights already suggested plainly enough." Captain Hale's party departed near dawn, taking careful, measured leave to allow their king a final private moment before the return journey properly began. And Cassian found Bryony alone in the clearing where they'd spent that peaceful final morning together, wildflowers still faintly visible in the pale early light. "I have to go," he said quietly, joining her. "I know. But I'll return. Properly, once the immediate danger's addressed and the kingdom's satisfied I'm genuinely safe. I want you to know that isn't simple royal courtesy, Bryony. I mean it entirely." She turned to face him fully, 7 nights of accumulated trust and affection settling into something she could finally, properly name. "I believe you, Cassian. Whatever complications wait ahead, I find I'm rather more willing to face them than my earlier uncertainty suggested." He reached out, gently tucking a strand of loose hair behind her ear, the gesture carrying a tenderness that needed no tail-thump translation whatsoever. "7 nights," he said softly. "I confess I've never properly valued anything so completely in all my considerable years as king." "Nor I," Bryony admitted, "though my 7 nights were rather more solitary than yours, given only one of us could properly speak." That earned a genuine, warm laugh, cutting cleanly through the morning's bittersweet weight, and when Cassian leaned in to press a gentle, questioning kiss to her forehead, Bryony found herself leaning into it fully. Old rejection and 2 years of careful solitude finally, thoroughly giving way to something she'd stopped believing herself capable of feeling again. "Until we meet properly," Cassian said, finally stepping back toward his waiting guard, golden eyes holding hers even as distance grew between them, as considerably more than wolf and healer. "Until then," Bryony agreed, watching him mount the horse Captain Hale offered, watching the small party disappear finally into the brightening forest, and found herself, despite the sudden, aching quiet of her now empty barn, considerably more hopeful than lonely, for the first time in 2 long, carefully solitary years. 3 weeks passed before Cassian's formal invitation arrived, carried by a considerably nervous young courier who clearly hadn't expected his delivery to a modest forest cottage to involve quite so much careful, repeated door-knocking before Bryony finally answered. "For you, my lady," he said, offering a sealed letter bearing the royal crest, his eyes widening slightly at the realization of precisely who he was addressing. "Personally, from His Majesty." The letter, once she'd settled at her kitchen table to read it properly, carried Cassian's voice so clearly she could nearly hear him speaking the words aloud. "Bryony. 3 weeks. And I confess I've thought of you considerably more than affairs of state properly permit. The immediate danger's been addressed. My counsel believes they've identified the source of the assassination attempt, though the full investigation continues. I won't rush you, but I find myself unable to wait much longer without at least asking properly. Will you come to the capital? Not as a formal guest requiring elaborate ceremony, simply as yourself, to see whether what grew between us in that barn survives translation to somewhat grander surroundings." Cassian Widow Pruitt, who had taken to visiting rather more frequently since the dramatic reveal 3 weeks earlier, arrived just as Bryony finished her second reading and took one look at her expression to properly guess the letter's contents. "He's asked you to visit. How did you—" "Dear, you're glowing considerably brighter than any letter about ordinary matters would produce." The older woman settled into her usual chair with visible satisfaction. "Well, will you go?" Bryony turned the letter over in her hands, old caution warring with 3 weeks of steadily building certainty that whatever she'd found with Cassian deserved proper chance to prove itself beyond the confines of her modest barn. "I think I will," she said finally. "Though I confess I have absolutely no idea what one wears to visit a king properly, nor how one behaves in a castle without embarrassing herself entirely." "You'll manage," Widow Pruitt said firmly. "You managed nursing an injured king back to health without the faintest idea who he actually was. I imagine formal castle etiquette will prove considerably less daunting by comparison." The journey to the capital took 4 days, considerably longer than Bryony expected, though the royal carriage Cassian had sent proved comfortable enough to make the distance bearable. And by the time the capital's grand towers finally rose into view on the horizon, her nervous anticipation had grown almost unbearable. Cassian himself waited at the palace gates when they finally arrived, dressed considerably more formally than she'd ever seen him, though his expression, upon spotting her, broke into something warm and entirely unguarded that had nothing whatsoever to do with royal formality. "You came," he said, crossing to help her down from the carriage himself, ignoring the visible surprise of several nearby attendants at their king performing such a menial task personally. "I said I would. I confess I spent considerable time these past 3 weeks worrying you might reconsider, given everything this visit properly implies." "I nearly did several times," Bryony admitted honestly, though I found myself each time rather unable to properly abandon what those 7 nights suggested was worth pursuing further. Cassian's smile deepened, and he offered his arm with careful formality that couldn't quite disguise the genuine warmth beneath it. "Then let me show you properly what those 7 nights only partially revealed." The palace proved considerably more overwhelming than Bryony had properly prepared herself for. Vast corridors lined with portraits of previous rulers, servants moving with practiced efficiency through spaces so grand they made her modest cottage feel almost laughably small by comparison, and everywhere, the particular watchful attention of a court curious about the mysterious woman who'd apparently captured their king's genuine interest. "You're being stared at," Cassian observed, guiding her through the palace's central hall. "I'm aware. I confess I'm not entirely certain how to properly manage it." "You manage it precisely as you managed me that first night," Cassian said, with plain, unbothered honesty. "The court respects genuine confidence considerably more than performed nobility, whatever some of the more traditional members might currently believe otherwise." They were interrupted by a woman approaching with the particular brisk authority of someone accustomed to managing considerable responsibility. Sharp-eyed, silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot, carrying herself with the bearing of someone who had clearly served the royal household for decades. "Your Majesty," she said, then turned her assessing gaze toward Bryony. "And this is the woman who's caused quite so much discussion these past 3 weeks. Bryony, this is Marchioness Vel, head of my royal household, and quite possibly the only person in this entire palace who speaks to me with total honesty regardless of my position." "Someone has to," Marchioness Vel said dryly, though her sharp eyes carried genuine warmth beneath their initial assessment. "My lady, I confess I was rather skeptical about this entire arrangement, given how quickly it developed under such unusual circumstances. Having now met you properly, I find myself considerably less skeptical than 3 weeks of court gossip suggested I should be." "That's high praise, apparently," Cassian said, something amused in his voice. "It's simple observation, sire. She's watching this entire palace with the same careful, unimpressed attention she likely gave your wolf form, rather than the overwhelmed awe most visitors properly display. That's rather promising, given the considerable weight your actual position eventually demands of anyone standing beside you." The evening's formal dinner proved considerably more trying than the earlier tour, Bryony finding herself seated beside Cassian at the head of a long table filled with court nobles, whose careful, curious attention never quite fully dissipated, despite her best effort to simply enjoy the meal. "You're doing wonderfully," Cassian murmured, low enough that only she could hear, midway through the third course. "I'm doing my absolute best not to use the wrong fork, mostly." "There's no wrong fork, technically. Simply various forks for various purposes that half this table couldn't properly explain if pressed." That earned a small, genuine laugh from her, cutting through some of the evening's accumulated tension, and Bryony found herself, gradually, relaxing into the rhythm of formal conversation despite her earlier nerves. It was near the meal's conclusion that Lord Ashby, a sharp-featured nobleman Bryony had noticed watching their exchange throughout dinner with something considerably less warm than simple curiosity, finally spoke directly to her. "Forgive my bluntness, my lady," he said, "but I confess I find myself curious about your particular background. An Omega, I understand, though not one currently attached to any recognized pack." Something in the careful phrasing carried unmistakable judgment, and Bryony felt the table's attention sharpen around them. "I was rejected from my birth pack 2 years ago," she said plainly, refusing to soften the admission for his benefit. "I've lived independently since, at the forest's edge, nursing injured creatures back to health when they need it." "How unusual," Lord Ashby said, something almost sneering beneath his careful courtesy. One wonders what particular deficiency warranted such a formal rejection. The table went uncomfortably quiet, and Bryony felt old shame rise briefly before she caught herself, deliberately, refusing to let 2 years of careful healing crumble beneath one nobleman's pointed cruelty. "My gift," she said steadily, "involves an unusual connection to animals, rather than the traditional talents my former pack valued. They decided that made me unsuitable rather than simply different. I've since built an entire independent life, proving that particular judgment considerably mistaken." "Independent living for a rejected Omega," Lord Ashby said, something dismissive in his tone despite his careful, formal phrasing. "How resourceful." "Lord Ashby," Cassian said, voice gone dangerously quiet, "I'd remind you that the woman you're currently attempting to insult saved my life during the very same period this council was mourning my apparent death. I'd suggest reconsidering both your tone and your continued interest in her personal history." Something flickered across Lord Ashby's face, not quite chagrin, but adjacent to it, before he inclined his head with careful, formal apology that carried little genuine sincerity behind it. "Of course, Your Majesty. I meant no offense." The dinner continued with considerably more careful courtesy after that, though Bryony noticed throughout the meal's remainder, Lord Ashby's continued watchful attention, carrying something considerably more calculating than simple curiosity. Later that night, walking back toward her guest chambers with Cassian's arm still offered for support, Bryony found herself turning the evening's tension over carefully. "He asked about my background rather too precisely for simple idle curiosity," she said, almost as though he'd already gathered considerable information before ever asking the question aloud. "You noticed that as well." "I've spent 2 years learning to read intent beneath careful performance, Cassian. Animals don't lie about their true feelings, whatever careful stillness they might project. I find the same instinct rather useful with people, once I know to properly look for it." "That's a valuable instinct," Cassian said, something thoughtful entering his expression. "I confess Lord Ashby's hostility tonight troubles me rather more than simple wounded pride over his daughter's disrupted prospects should properly warrant. You think there's something more deliberate happening?" "I think," Cassian said carefully, "that I'd rather not dismiss anything as simple coincidence, given recent circumstances." "He's dangerous," Marchioness Vel said the following morning, finding Bryony in the palace gardens where she'd retreated for some quiet reflection after the previous evening's tense dinner. "Lord Ashby, I mean. I noticed you observing his particular interest rather closely. He seemed rather more hostile than simple courtly skepticism warranted." "That's because his hostility runs considerably deeper than simple skepticism about your background, Marchioness." Vel settled onto the bench beside her, expression grave. "Lord Ashby's daughter was, until quite recently, considered the most likely candidate for the king's formal marriage. Your sudden, dramatic arrival has rather thoroughly disrupted those careful, long-standing plans." Something cold settled in Bryony's stomach. "You think he might be dangerous, genuinely dangerous, not simply socially hostile." "I think," Marchioness Vel said carefully, "that the timing of the assassination attempt, occurring precisely when Lord Ashby's careful marital arrangements were reaching their final stages, deserves rather more scrutiny than the initial investigation properly gave it." "Does Cassian know your suspicions?" "I've raised them. He's cautious about accusing a powerful nobleman without proper evidence, which is reasonable politically, though I confess I worry that same caution might prove costly if my suspicions prove accurate." Bryony turned this new information over carefully, old instinct sharpening into something considerably more alert than the previous evening's simple social discomfort. "What would you have me do?" "Simply remain watchful," Marchioness Vel said. "You have a particular gift for reading genuine intent beneath careful performance. I watched you do precisely that at dinner last night, recognizing his hostility for what it actually was despite his careful courtly phrasing. That instinct may prove valuable, should Lord Ashby's ambitions extend beyond simple social disapproval." Cassian found her still in the garden an hour later, expression immediately concerned at whatever he read in her careful, thoughtful expression. "Marchioness Vel spoke with you." "About Lord Ashby, yes, about his daughter, and the marriage arrangement your survival apparently disrupted." Cassian's jaw tightened. "I should have mentioned it myself before you arrived. I confess I didn't properly want to burden your first visit with quite so much political complexity. I'd rather know the full complexity than be protected from it, Cassian, particularly if it involves genuine danger." "You're right," he admitted. "I apologize. The investigation into the assassination attempt has focused primarily on foreign interests, given the political tensions along our eastern border. But Marchioness Vel's suspicions about Lord Ashby aren't unfounded, and I should have shared them properly before now." "What do you intend to do?" "Watch him carefully. Gather proper evidence before making any formal accusation, given his considerable standing within the council makes premature action politically dangerous." Cassian took her hand, something protective entering his expression. "And ensure you're properly protected throughout your visit, regardless of what his actual intentions prove to be." The following days passed with considerably more careful vigilance than Bryony's initial visit had suggested would prove necessary. though the genuine warmth between herself and Cassian continued developing steadily despite the underlying political tension. She found herself increasingly comfortable within the palace's grand corridors, developing genuine friendship with Marchioness Vel's brisk, honest company, and discovering, gradually, that Cassian's actual daily life as king carried considerably more genuine burden and careful diplomacy than the romantic simplicity of their 7 barn-bound nights had properly suggested. "You work considerably harder than I expected," she observed one evening, finding him still reviewing correspondence well past the hour most courtiers had retired. "Ruling a kingdom doesn't pause simply because I'd rather be spending the evening with considerably more pleasant company," Cassian said, though his weary smile suggested genuine appreciation for her presence despite the workload. "Though I confess your company makes even tedious correspondence feel rather less burdensome." "That's kind of you to say, given I'm mostly simply sitting here reading while you work properly. Your presence alone helps considerably more than you likely realize." He set down his pen, studying her with something warm and genuine. "How are you finding palace life, honestly? I worry sometimes that the grandeur and Lord Ashby's continued hostility might be souring what should be a rather more pleasant visit." "I'm finding it considerably more complicated than 7 nights in a barn," Bryony admitted, "but not unwelcome exactly. I find myself genuinely curious about this fuller version of you, the king who works considerably harder than court gossip properly credits, who values Marchioness Vel's honest counsel over easy flattery, who took personal risk helping me down from a carriage rather than allowing formal protocol to prevent it. And Lord Ashby's hostility? Concerning, certainly. Though I confess I'd rather face that concern directly, alongside you, than retreat back to my cottage simply because complexity arrived alongside the romance." Cassian's expression softened into something entirely unguarded. "I'm grateful for that, Bryony. More than I can properly express." It was in that quiet, genuine moment that a servant arrived breathlessly at the study door, interrupting with visible urgency. "Your Majesty, Marchioness Vel requests your immediate presence. She's discovered something significant regarding the assassination investigation and insists it can't properly wait until morning." Cassian was on his feet immediately, formal weariness replaced by sharp, focused attention. "Bring her here directly." Marchioness Vel arrived moments later, considerably less composed than her usual brisk manner suggested was typical, a sealed letter clutched in one hand. "I've been quietly reviewing the household accounts these past weeks," she said without preamble, cross-referencing them against the assassination attempt's timeline, as I mentioned I intended. "I found this correspondence hidden among Lord Ashby's steward's personal papers, obtained through means I'd rather not detail formally, though I assure you they were entirely justified given the circumstances." She handed the letter to Cassian, who scanned it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. "This is a payment record," he said grimly. "Considerable funds, transferred to a hunting guide 3 days before the boar hunt, with a note referencing ensuring proper opportunity." "The same hunting guide," Marchioness Vel confirmed, "who happened to position your party precisely where the fatal arrow was loosed, and who has, conveniently, been entirely unreachable for questioning since the attempt itself." Bryony felt cold dread settle low in her stomach. "You believe Lord Ashby arranged the entire attempt?" "I believe the evidence strongly suggests it," Marchioness Vel said, "though I'd stress this remains circumstantial without the guide's own testimony to properly confirm the connection." "Then we find the guide," Cassian said, jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "Immediately, before Lord Ashby has further opportunity to properly cover his tracks, now that he presumably suspects his careful arrangement failed to permanently remove the obstacle to his daughter's marriage prospects." The following days passed in a tense blur of careful investigation. Cassian's most trusted guards dispatched quietly to locate the missing hunting guide, while the court, oblivious to the unfolding crisis, continued its usual rhythm of formal dinners and careful political maneuvering, Bryony found herself drawn increasingly into Marchioness Vell's confidence during this period, the two women developing a genuine, easy partnership as they reviewed additional household records for further evidence of Lord Ashby's involvement. "You have a remarkably sharp eye for inconsistency," Marchioness Vell observed, watching Bryony flag a discrepancy in one ledger that had escaped her own initial review. "Have you considered formal service to the Crown, once this current unpleasantness properly resolves?" "I confess I hadn't considered it at all, given I only arrived at this palace 3 weeks ago, believing myself simply visiting a man I'd nursed back to health. Circumstances have a way of expanding rather more quickly than initial expectations suggest," Marchioness Vell said dryly. "Particularly for someone who apparently possesses both genuine kindness and sharp, practical observation in equal measure. Rather rare combination, in my considerable experience with court society." It was Bryony herself, 3 days into the careful investigation, who noticed something the guards' more formal search had overlooked entirely. A groundskeeper, tending the palace's eastern hedges with unusual deliberate attention to a particular section that seemed, upon closer examination, to conceal a narrow, rarely used servant's path. "That path," she said to Cassian, pointing it out during their evening walk through the gardens. Old instinct from years of tracking injured animals through unfamiliar forest terrain sharpening her attention. "It's been used recently. Considerably more recently than the overgrown state of the surrounding hedge properly suggests should be possible." Cassian studied the path with fresh interest, calling for guards to investigate properly, and within the hour, their search revealed a hidden cottage at the path's end, considerably more comfortable than its concealed location suggested should be necessary for simple groundskeeping storage. "Someone's been living here," Cassian said, examining the cottage's interior with grim satisfaction. "Recently, and in considerable comfort." The hunting guide, when guards finally located him hiding within the cottage's cellar, proved rather less loyal to Lord Ashby than his continued silence had initially suggested, breaking almost immediately under Cassian's direct, controlled questioning. "He paid me considerably," the guide admitted, visibly terrified, "to position the king's party near the ridge, where a stray arrow might plausibly explain an unfortunate accident. I didn't fire it myself, Your Majesty. I swear it. Lord Ashby's own huntsman handled that particular task, though I confess I knew precisely what was being arranged when I accepted the payment." "You'll testify to this formally," Cassian said, voice cold and controlled, "before the full council." "I will, Your Majesty. I've had considerable time hiding in that cellar to properly reconsider my own complicity in this matter." Lord Ashby's formal arrest, when it finally came 2 days later, unfolded with considerably more public drama than the quiet investigation had suggested was likely, the nobleman's composed denial crumbling entirely once the hunting guide's formal testimony, alongside Marchioness Vell's carefully gathered financial evidence, was presented before the full assembled council. "You'd have had me killed," Cassian said, addressing Lord Ashby directly once the formal charges had been read, "simply to preserve your daughter's marriage prospects, rather than accept my genuine choice regarding my own personal life." "Your genuine choice," Lord Ashby spat, composure finally, fully abandoning him, "threatens generations of careful political alliance for the sake of some rejected Forest Omega with no proper standing whatsoever." "That rejected Forest Omega," Cassian said, voice carrying cold, unmistakable authority, "saved my life during the very same period your careful conspiracy nearly succeeded in ending it. I'd suggest reconsidering precisely whose judgment this council should properly trust going forward." Lord Ashby was led away under guard, his formal trial scheduled for the following month, and the assembled council, watching this dramatic unraveling, offered Bryony considerably more genuine respect in its immediate aftermath than her earlier, more tentative reception had suggested was likely. That evening, once the day's dramatic proceedings had finally settled, Bryony found Cassian alone in the palace gardens, exhaustion and profound relief both evident in his tired expression. "You solved it," he said as she settled beside him. "The hidden path, the guide's location, none of that would have surfaced properly without your particular instincts. I simply noticed something out of place. The same instinct that first led me to your wolf form at my garden gate, honestly." "That instinct has now saved my life twice," Cassian said, taking her hand with quiet, genuine gratitude. "I find myself increasingly certain, Bryony, that whatever hesitation I initially carried about your suitability for this complicated royal life was entirely, thoroughly mistaken." Lord Ashby certainly believed otherwise. Lord Ashby was a traitor motivated by his own ambition, not a reliable judge of anyone's actual worth. Cassian turned to face her fully, something warm and certain settling into his tired features. "I've spent this past month watching you navigate considerable complexity, political hostility, formal court expectations, genuine danger, with the same steady, unguarded honesty that first drew me to you during those 7 nights in your barn. I find myself entirely unwilling to imagine continuing this particular life without you properly beside me." Bryony felt her breath catch at the weight beneath his words. Old caution, finally. Completely giving way to something she'd stopped believing herself capable of feeling again these past 2 solitary years. "What are you asking, Cassian?" "Precisely what you think I'm asking," he said, something both nervous and entirely certain in his expression. "Though I confess I'd like to properly ask it once matters have settled rather more fully. With the ceremony and consideration such a question genuinely deserves, rather than simply blurting it out in a garden immediately following a traitor's arrest." Bryony laughed, warm and genuine, some of the day's accumulated tension finally breaking. "That's rather considerate of you, given how thoroughly our entire courtship has already defied every conventional expectation." "I find myself increasingly comfortable with defying convention, where you're concerned," Cassian said, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to her temple. "Though I promise you, Bryony, whenever I do properly ask, the answer will matter more to me than any crown I currently wear." The morning of the trial arrived gray and overcast, matching Bryony's own nervous mood as she dressed carefully with the assistance of a lady's maid Marchioness Vell had assigned her for the occasion. A young woman named Pella, who seemed determined to fuss over every detail of Bryony's appearance with the particular seriousness of someone acutely aware how thoroughly the assembled court would be watching. "You look every inch a future queen," Pella said, adjusting a final pin in Bryony's carefully arranged hair. "Whatever nerves you're currently feeling, I promise they won't show." "I appreciate the reassurance, even if I'm not entirely convinced by it." Cassian himself arrived at her chambers moments before they were due to depart for the council chamber, dressed in formal royal attire that struck her, even after weeks of growing familiarity, as still somehow strange atop the man she'd first known only as an enormous gray wolf. "You look magnificent," he said, taking in her formal gown with open admiration. "Though I confess I find myself missing some mornings, the simple sight of you in your worn cottage dress, hair still tangled from sleep." "Flatterer. Though I'll admit I miss those mornings myself, some days, however much I've come to value this new life alongside them." He took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Whatever today brings, I'm grateful you're facing it beside me rather than watching from some safer distance. I wouldn't have it any other way, Cassian. Whatever today costs either of us." Lord Ashby's formal trial convened 3 weeks after his arrest. The Grand Council chamber filled to capacity with nobles eager to witness the dramatic proceedings, and Bryony found herself seated beside Marchioness Vell in a gallery reserved for witnesses, watching Cassian preside over the formal charges with a composed authority that still, occasionally, struck her as remarkable, given how thoroughly she'd first known him as a silent, injured wolf. "You're nervous," Marchioness Vell observed, noting Bryony's tightly folded hands. "I'm testifying today about the hidden path, the discovery that led to the guide's capture. I confess public speaking before an entire assembled council wasn't among the skills I properly developed nursing injured forest creatures. You'll manage. You've managed considerably more daunting circumstances these past weeks than simple testimony properly requires. The morning's proceedings opened with the hunting guide's formal testimony, delivered with the particular nervous thoroughness of a man determined to properly secure whatever leniency his cooperation might earn him, followed by Marchioness Vell's careful presentation of the financial evidence she'd gathered. When Bryony's turn finally came, she found herself considerably steadier than her earlier nerves had suggested, describing the hidden path's discovery with the same plain, careful honesty that had, apparently, become something of a personal trademark throughout her unexpected month at court. "And what led you to notice this particular path?" the council's presiding magistrate asked, when the palace's own trained guards had overlooked it entirely. "I've spent 2 years tracking injured animals through unfamiliar forest terrain," Bryony said. "You learn to notice disturbed ground, deliberately concealed paths, the particular signs of recent passage that untrained eyes typically miss. I simply applied that same attention to the palace grounds." A murmur of genuine interest moved through the assembled council, and Lord Ashby, seated at the defendant's table with his composure considerably diminished from their first hostile dinner encounter, glared at her with undisguised resentment. "A remarkable skill," the magistrate said, "for someone the council understands was formally rejected from traditional pack society. My former pack rejected the skill precisely because they found it strange rather than valuable," Bryony said steadily. "I'd suggest today's proceedings demonstrate rather clearly how mistaken that particular judgment proved to be." Several council members exchanged approving glances at that, and even the stern magistrate's expression carried something close to genuine respect. The trial's dramatic conclusion arrived that afternoon, when Lord Ashby, faced with the overwhelming combination of financial evidence and the guide's detailed testimony, finally abandoned his careful denials entirely. "Yes," he said, voice carrying bitter, unrepentant fury rather than any genuine remorse. "I arranged it. I watched my daughter's careful preparation for eventual marriage to the crown dissolve the moment this forest omega arrived, uninvited and entirely unsuitable, disrupting generations of proper political planning. I don't regret the attempt. I regret only its failure." The chamber erupted into shocked murmuring at the open admission, and Cassian's expression, watching from his formal seat, carried cold, controlled fury that Bryony hadn't witnessed from him even during their tensest moments together. "You'll be sentenced according to full formal law," Cassian said, voice carrying unmistakable authority across the hushed chamber, "for treason against the crown and attempted regicide. Your title is stripped effective immediately. Your holdings revert to crown control pending full review." "And my daughter?" Lord Ashby demanded, some genuine desperation finally breaking through his earlier bitter composure. "She's innocent of my choices entirely." "Your daughter's innocence will be properly investigated separately," Cassian said, something marginally gentler entering his voice at the mention of an apparently blameless party. "I've no interest in punishing her for crimes she didn't commit, whatever her father's considerable failures." Lord Ashby was led from the chamber under guard, his formal sentencing to follow within the week, and the assembled council, watching this dramatic conclusion, offered a spontaneous round of relieved applause that Bryony found herself joining despite her own residual nervousness from the day's proceedings. Fitch, one of the older council members who'd remained notably skeptical of Bryony's presence throughout the preceding weeks, approached her as the chamber began to empty. "Your testimony today was considerably more compelling than I anticipated, my lady," he said, something grudging but genuine in his admission. "I confess I harbored my own doubts about this king's rather unconventional choice of companion. I find those doubts rather thoroughly addressed by this afternoon's proceedings. That means considerably more to me than you likely realize, councilman." "See that it continues meaning something," he said, not unkindly. "This kingdom needs a queen willing to notice what others overlook, same as you did with that hidden path." I suspect you'll manage that particular responsibility rather well." That evening, Cassian found her in the palace gardens once more, the same bench where they'd sat together following his initial confrontation with Lord Ashby weeks earlier. "It's finally over," he said, settling beside her with visible exhaustion. "The investigation, the trial, the immediate danger. I confess I hadn't properly realized how much weight I'd been carrying until this moment, watching it finally lift. How do you feel? Relieved? Exhausted? Considerably more certain than I've felt in longer than I care to admit about what I want going forward." He turned to face her properly, something warm and unguarded in his tired expression. "I promised you a proper question, once matters had settled. I find myself entirely unwilling to wait any longer for the ceremony I originally intended." Bryony's breath caught. "Cassian. Let me say this properly, please, before nerves entirely overtake my carefully rehearsed words." He took both her hands in his, golden eyes steady despite visible nervousness beneath his composed exterior. "I fell in love with you before I even possessed proper words to say so, Bryony. 7 nights of tail thumps and quiet company taught me more about genuine connection than 7 years of careful, calculated courtship ever managed. I've spent this past month watching you navigate considerable complexity, political hostility, formal expectations, genuine danger, with unwavering honesty and remarkable courage. I don't want to imagine continuing this life, complicated and demanding as it inevitably remains, without you properly beside me as my equal partner, not simply my companion." He drew a small velvet box from his coat pocket, opening it to reveal a ring set with a stone, the exact golden color of his own wolf-form eyes. "Will you marry me, Bryony? Properly, formally as my wife and my queen, whatever complications that considerable title continues to demand of us both?" Bryony felt tears gather despite her best effort at composure. 2 years of careful solitude and old rejection finally, completely giving way to something she genuinely stopped believing herself capable of experiencing again. "Yes," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Cassian. Considerably more certainly than I've felt about anything in longer than 2 very long years." Cassian's answering smile broke across his face like sunrise, and when he slid the ring onto her trembling finger before pulling her into a proper, thorough kiss, Bryony found herself laughing through her own happy tears. The garden's quiet witness to a moment considerably more significant than either of them had properly imagined, when a wounded wolf first collapsed against a cottage gate 7 weeks earlier. News of the royal engagement spread through the palace with remarkable speed, and Bryony found herself, over the following days, navigating an entirely new landscape of court attention, considerably warmer, on the whole, than her earlier tentative reception, though not without its own complications. "You're the talk of the entire kingdom," Marchioness Vel reported, arriving at Bryony's chambers with a stack of correspondence that had apparently arrived overnight from various noble houses eager to properly congratulate, or subtly assess, the king's unexpected choice of bride. Some genuine well-wishes, certainly. Considerable curiosity as well, given how thoroughly your circumstances defy traditional expectations. I confess I hadn't properly prepared myself for this particular scale of attention. Few people do, honestly, regardless of how they arrive at royal engagement. Marchioness Vel settled into her usual chair, expression turning more serious. "There will be formal training required, Bryony, before the wedding properly proceeds. Court protocol, formal history, the particular ceremonial requirements a queen's role demands. I don't say this to discourage you, only to properly prepare you for the considerable work ahead. I expected as much. I'd rather face it directly than pretend the transition will prove simple." "That's precisely the attitude that will serve you well, I think." Marchioness Vel's expression softened into something genuinely warm. "For what it's worth, my lady, soon to be your majesty, I find myself considerably more optimistic about this kingdom's future with you as queen than I've felt in considerable years watching various careful, calculated marriage prospects parade through this palace. The formal training, once it properly began, proved considerably more demanding than Bryony had anticipated, filling her days with careful instruction in court history, ceremonial protocol, and the particular diplomatic language required for formal royal correspondence. A tutor named Master Ellery, elderly and exacting, arrived each morning promptly at sunrise to drill her in genealogies of neighboring kingdoms, proper forms of address for visiting dignitaries, and the considerable weight of ceremonial history attached to even the smallest royal gesture. "You'll forgive my bluntness, your future majesty," Master Ellery said one particularly exhausting afternoon, watching her struggle through the correct formal greeting for a visiting delegation from the Northern Territories. "But you learn rather faster than most candidates I've had the pleasure of instructing over considerable years of service." "I'm not entirely certain that's true, given how thoroughly I just mangled the Northern Territories' formal titles." "You mangled them considerably less than the last young lady I attempted to instruct, who once addressed an entire visiting delegation as though they were common merchants rather than royal cousins." Master Ellery's stern expression cracked into something almost fond. "Perseverance matters rather more than immediate perfection, in my considerable experience." "You're doing remarkably well," Cassian told her one evening, finding her exhausted but persevering through yet another lesson in formal etiquette. "Marchioness Vels reported considerable progress to me directly, which, given her typically demanding standards, represents genuine praise. I feel considerably less remarkable most days, muddling through formal protocol I never properly imagined needing to learn." "You're learning it faster than most formally trained candidates manage, from what I understand." He settled beside her, taking her hand with easy affection that had grown over these past weeks into comfortable habit rather than nervous novelty. "Though I confess I rather missed the simplicity of those 7 nights, when our entire relationship existed through tail thumps and quiet barn conversation, uncomplicated by formal ceremony." "I miss it too some days," Bryony admitted. "Though I find myself, increasingly, valuing this fuller understanding of who you actually are, the king who works considerably harder than court gossip credits, who trusts Marchioness Vels' honest counsel, who took genuine political risk choosing me over generations of careful marital planning." "That risk's already proven considerably worthwhile," Cassian said. "Whatever additional complexity it continues demanding of us both." It was during this period of intensive preparation that Bryony finally met Lord Ashby's daughter, Lady Miriam, formally cleared of any complicity in her father's treasonous scheme, and permitted, following careful investigation, to retain her own more modest holdings separate from her father's stripped title. "I owe you an apology," Lady Miriam said finally, breaking the awkward silence of their first meeting. "Not for my father's crimes, which were entirely his own choice and his own failure, but for my own silence these past weeks. You weren't obligated to speak against your own father, whatever his failures. I never particularly wanted marriage to the king, if I'm being fully truthful," Lady Miriam admitted. "It was my father's ambition. I find myself, watching your engagement unfold, feeling something closer to relief than the resentment court gossip apparently expects from me. I hope you'll consider remaining at court, if that's genuinely what you want," Bryony said. "I confess I could use considerably more genuine friendship here." Lady Miriam's answering smile carried real warmth. "I'd like that, Your Majesty. Genuinely." "Not Your Majesty quite yet," Bryony said, laughing. "Simply Bryony, please, at least in private company." The two women grew close over the following weeks, Lady Miriam proving an unexpected source of gentle guidance through the more subtle currents of court politics that Master Ellery's formal instruction couldn't quite properly cover. The wedding date was finally set for early spring, 3 months hence. Widow Pruitt, invited formally to attend, arrived at the palace with barely contained delight at witnessing firsthand the scale of gossip-worthy drama she'd apparently predicted from the very first muddy morning. "I told you," the older woman announced, taking in the palace's grandeur with open, unashamed wonder. "I told you there was a proper story unfolding in that barn." "You did indeed, Widow Pruitt. I'm genuinely happy for you, Bryony. You've earned this particular happiness after everything the past years demanded of you." That same evening, Cassian arranged a small, informal dinner, considerably less grand than the palace's usual formal affairs, bringing together the small circle of people who had, over these past months, become genuinely important to both of them. Widow Pruitt held court at one end of the table, delighting Marchioness Vell with increasingly elaborate accounts of village gossip. Lady Miriam sat quietly beside Master Ellery. The two of them engaged in an animated debate about proper historical precedent that suggested a friendship developing entirely independent of Bryony's own influence. "This is rather nice," Bryony murmured to Cassian, watching the easy warmth around the table. "That's rather the point," Cassian said, smiling. "I find myself preferring genuine company to careful performance, whenever circumstance permits the choice." Widow Pruitt, catching the tail end of this exchange, raised her glass with theatrical flourish. "To the Wolf King and his considerably braver bride, then. May this kingdom finally learn what the rest of us discovered rather more quickly, that genuine kindness outlasts careful calculation, every single time." The table raised their glasses in warm agreement, and Bryony, watching the easy laughter and genuine affection surrounding her, found herself struck by how completely her life had transformed since that storm-soaked evening at her garden gate. 3 months, she said quietly to Cassian later, as the dinner wound toward its comfortable close. "I confess I'm rather looking forward to it, despite the considerable work still ahead." "As am I," Cassian said, taking her hand beneath the table with easy, comfortable affection. "Whatever complications remain, I find myself entirely certain about the outcome waiting at the end of them." The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, spring sunshine breaking gold across the palace grounds in a way that struck Bryony, dressing with Pella's careful assistance as almost deliberately symbolic, given how thoroughly a single stormy night had first set this entire remarkable journey into motion. "Nervous?" Pella asked, adjusting the final pin in an elaborate hairstyle that had taken the better part of 2 hours to properly arrange. "Considerably. Though I confess it's a rather different nervousness than 7 months ago, standing in my barn wondering exactly what I'd gotten myself into, nursing an enormous, uncannily attentive wolf." "I imagine so, Your Majesty." Pella's use of the formal title, still new enough to feel slightly unreal, made Bryony's breath catch. "Not quite yet," she said softly. "Though I suppose by this evening, that title will finally prove accurate." Widow Pruitt found her in the final moments before the ceremony. Resplendent in a formal gown Marchioness Vell had insisted upon for the occasion, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief she'd clearly prepared in advance for exactly this kind of emotional display. "You look radiant, dear," the older woman said, voice thick with genuine emotion. "I confess I never properly imagined, delivering that first basket of bread to your cottage all those months ago, that I'd end up here, attending your wedding to the king himself." "Neither did I, honestly." "Life has a considerable talent for surprising us when we least expect it." Widow Pruitt squeezed her hands warmly. "Your mother would be proud, dear, wherever she is. Whatever your former pack's cruel judgment claimed about your worth, today proves rather definitively how thoroughly mistaken they were." Bryony felt fresh tears threaten at the mention of her long-dead mother, old grief mingling with the day's overwhelming joy in a way that felt, somehow, entirely appropriate. "Thank you, Widow Pruitt, for everything these past months. The bread, the gossip, the genuine friendship when I needed it most. Someone had to properly look after you, dear." I'm simply glad it worked out rather better than either of us initially expected. The ceremony itself unfolded with considerably more grandeur than Bryony had properly imagined possible, the palace's great hall filled with nobles and commoners alike. The formal vows exchanged before an assembly considerably larger than any gathering she'd previously navigated during her months of preparation. But it was Cassian's face, waiting for her at the ceremony's center, that held her full attention throughout. The same warm, steady golden eyes she'd first properly seen catch moonlight 7 months earlier, now watching her approach with an expression of such complete, unguarded joy that every lingering nervousness dissolved entirely. "You came?" he murmured, echoing his own words from that first palace arrival as she finally reached him. "I said I would," she echoed back, smiling despite the formal weight of the ceremony surrounding them. The formal vows themselves passed in something of a blur, Bryony's attention caught entirely by the warmth in Cassian's steady gaze, by the genuine tremor in his own voice as he spoke his promises before the assembled court, by the particular, perfect rightness of finally, formally becoming exactly what those 7 remarkable nights had first, quietly suggested was possible. "I now pronounce you King and Queen," the officiant announced, and the great hall erupted into genuine, warm celebration as Cassian pulled her into a kiss that carried considerably more emotion than royal formality typically permitted, the assembled court's cheering barely registering against the overwhelming joy of the moment. The formal reception that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with dancing, toasts, and the particular warm chaos of celebration that Bryony found herself, despite months of careful formal training, genuinely, unreservedly enjoying rather than simply enduring. "You've managed this remarkably well," Marchioness Vel observed, finding her briefly alone near the refreshment table. "I confess I harbored my own doubts, that first week, about whether court life would properly suit someone who'd spent 2 years in solitary forest living. I find those doubts thoroughly, happily addressed today. I couldn't have managed any of it without your guidance, Marchioness Vel. Truly." Lady Miriam found her shortly after, considerably more relaxed and genuinely joyful than Bryony had witnessed from her during their earlier, more careful acquaintance. "I'm genuinely happy for you both," she said, embracing Bryony warmly. It was near midnight, the formal celebration finally winding toward its natural conclusion, that Cassian found her alone on the same garden bench where he'd first proposed months earlier, moonlight silvering the same flowers that had witnessed so much of their remarkable courtship. "Slipping away from your own wedding celebration, Your Majesty. Simply seeking a quiet moment to properly appreciate everything today's meant. May I join that quiet appreciation?" "Always. 7 nights," she said softly. "I still find myself amazed, some days, that something so significant grew from such an unlikely, uncertain beginning. I've thought the same, more times than I could properly count these past months." Cassian took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Bryony. Considerably more today than even this morning, if such continued growth remains properly possible." "I love you too," she said simply, resting her head against his shoulder as the garden settled into peaceful, moonlit quiet around them. Epilogue. 3 years later, the kingdom Cassian and Bryony governed together had transformed considerably from the careful, formal court Bryony had first nervously navigated, genuine warmth replacing much of the old calculated performance. Formal council sessions marked by actual listening rather than careful political maneuvering. Widow Pruitt visited regularly, having formed an unlikely but genuine friendship with Master Ellery. Marchioness Vel remained an essential presence at court. Lady Miriam had, over the intervening years, become not simply a close friend, but a genuinely valued advisor, eventually finding happiness in a marriage of her own choosing. And in the palace nursery, considerably more life and joyful noise had accumulated than the formal, quiet rooms had known in generations. A daughter, dark-haired and golden-eyed, exactly like her father, who had inherited, alongside her striking coloring, a considerable talent for finding injured creatures throughout the palace grounds and insisting, with the particular stubborn determination her mother recognized rather fondly from her own childhood, on nursing each one back to health. "She takes after you," Cassian observed one evening, watching their daughter attempt, with limited success, to properly bandage an injured garden bird's wing under Bryony's patient supervision. "I'd say she takes after both of us, honestly, given how thoroughly you've spoiled her with stories about her father's own wolf-form adventures." Bryony laughed, watching their daughter finally, triumphantly complete her bandaging with visible pride, and felt the full weight of everything 3 remarkable years had built from that single storm-soaked night when an injured wolf first collapsed against her garden gate. "Regrets?" Cassian asked. "Not a single one," Bryony said. "Every difficult, uncertain moment led precisely here after all. I wouldn't trade a single piece of that remarkable journey. If this story found its way into your heart, the storm-soaked gate, the 7 nights of tail thumps and quiet company, the moment moonlight finally revealed a king, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. And if you're hungry for another tale of unlikely beginnings and hard-won love, just say the word."